So welcome back to the third and final meeting of our School Discipline Fix book club with myself. I'm Stuart Ablon and my co-author, Dr. Alisha Pollastri. So let's just talk quickly about where we've been and where we're going to go today. Where we've been is we started off in our first meeting together talking about a different way of looking at challenging behaviors, rethinking challenging behaviors, and all that means for school discipline. And then in our second meeting, we got down to, okay, if you shifted your thinking to see discipline through the lens of skill, not will, what does that mean for your behavior intervention planning and for your interventions themselves? I'm not surprised to see a smaller group, at least now, for our third meeting, because our third meeting is really about trying to scale and sustain that shift in discipline school-wide. So we were expecting and hoping that we would, in particular, draw many school administrators and school leaders here who are charged with doing just that. And this is going to be tailored for that subset of folks who are interested in implementing this shift in discipline school-wide. Having said that, if you're an individual educator in your school, there's going to be plenty that I think is going to be quite relevant and hopefully useful for you here as well. So specifically, what are we going to focus on today? First, we're going to talk about what is system-wide implementation of collaborative problem solving. And as you'll hear from Dr. Pollastri, when we talk about system-wide implementation, in this case, we're talking about implementing collaborative problem solving, but many of the lessons that we've learned and that we'll share with you are drawn right from implementation science, as well as our own experience. And so really, they're about system-wide implementation of any evidence-based practice. Here, we're talking about collaborative problem solving. But then we're also going to talk about practicing what you preach, which is, in other words, how can you use collaborative problem solving with your colleagues in the building to accomplish this shift and sustain it? We will also talk about many of the common challenges to school-wide implementation. Our goal here is to be light on content and heavy on discussion. Let's remember, this is supposed to be a book club. So imagine we're all sitting around with maybe some wine and cheese as well, which is why it helps if you have your camera on. We have some questions that have been submitted in advance, but we really encourage you to raise your hand, submit questions in the chat. And really anything related to school-wide collaborative problem solving is welcome. We'd like this third and final book club to be as interactive as possible. So with that introduction, I will turn things over to Dr. Pollastri, who's going to start us off today.
Thank you, Stuart, and nice to see everyone. It's as Stuart said, this is probably a group of folks that are really invested on making CPS go bigger. And so the first thing, our first topic we're going to be we'll do about 15 minutes on each of the key topics that Stuart just mentioned to you. And the first one, I think it's really important first to talk about what system-wide implementation looks like, because a lot of folks believe that if they just send all their staff to a CPS training and all of the staff in the school are using CPS in their own classrooms, that's it. That's school-wide CPS implementation. And so I think it's important to start in a place where we make the distinction between all the practitioners, the teachers practicing CPS, and what we mean when we say system-wide implementation. Because when we take CPS system-wide, when you expect your entire school to be using CPS, yes, you do want every educator in the school to be using collaborative problem solving that is both approaching children with the CPS philosophy and using the intervention, deciding between plan A, plan B, plan C, using plan B wherever they can in emergency and proactive ways in the classroom. Yes, that's a core part, and CPS implementation can't happen without that piece. But that's not it. That's not sufficient. There are other things that happen when CPS has really gone sustainably system-wide. For instance, the discipline policy is usually one of the first things that needs to be looked at deeply and often modified. When do kids, depending on the level of your kids and what your policy looks like now, when do they get sent out of the classroom into the office? What constitutes a detention? Why do we give detentions anyway? What do they do while they're there? What constitutes a suspension? Why do we give them? What are kids expected to do? When do they come back? These sorts of discipline policies, when you look through a CPS lens, often look really different. And so you can't have every teacher in their own classroom doing CPS and not take a look at the school-wide discipline policy, right? Some other things that change: IEP meetings and IEP goals, how teams get together to determine whether a child should be getting special ed services and what those services are going to look like. Documentation practices, how teachers communicate across, again, depending on the level of the school. Sometimes this is more important in the older levels, where one student goes across 7 different teachers in a day, but also at the lower levels when kids are leaving to go to specials, or even the lunchroom and the playground, and you've got aides out there. We need to communicate across the adults. What does that look like? So the communication structures may also change. So when we talk about system-wide implementation, it's, yes, every teacher using CPS, and then it's also that structure. So I'd love to hear from the group, if anyone who's brave, tell me, is there anyone who is trying to do system-wide CPS in their school or district? Or are you thinking about it? Or are you hoping to do it? And if so, what are the challenges that you're thinking about in any of those cases? What are the challenges that you're encountering when you think about those sorts of system-wide implementation strategies? Yeah, go ahead, Julianne.
So I'll just go first. I'm a parent of an elementary school child, but I've used CPS for years in a hospital setting, in inpatient mental health. So I'm very familiar with the model and kind of what it's like when it's already implemented into a system, and training new employees on it. But I'm trying to get my elementary school on board with the philosophy, the model, kind of a different way of thinking, and just at the very beginning stages of introducing the model to the vice principal and that stage. So that's where I guess I'm coming from personally.
Yeah, so getting the stakeholders invested in CPS when maybe the stakeholders have never heard of it, don't know anything about it. This was by far, Julianne, it's like you were a plant here, because that's an excellent segue into the questions that we got in advance of this book club. The most common question we got was, how do I convince others to do CPS? We heard it from parents who are saying, this is working for my kid, their outpatient therapist is using it, and I want them to use it at the school too. We heard it from parents like yourself that are like, I don't just want you to use it with my kid, I want you to do this school-wide. I think that the whole school could benefit from this. We heard from teachers, from educators who aren't the decision makers for their school or district, that were saying, how do I get the decision makers on board? How do I introduce this to my principal when my principal's never heard of it, or to the superintendent? So this was by far, in lots of different forms, the most common question we got. And we do have some strategies for that, because we've seen people do that successfully. Stuart, you've seen this, I mean, for years and years and years, and that's why we started bringing it to schools, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about what you've seen work?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say in this context is that you have to try to avoid, and this is especially hard, the more passionate you are about this, you have to try to avoid the ironic move of trying to impose collaborative problem solving on people. I mean, if you listen to the question, right, the question is, how do I convince people to sort of do or use collaborative problem solving, which, in collaborative problem solving jargon, we would say that sounds like, how do I use tricky plan A to try to get people to use collaborative problem solving? And if there is one thing I have learned the hard way over the years, is that you can't use plan A to get your colleagues to use plan B. And by the way, even if you hold the sort of power, even if you are the leader of the school, trying to impose collaborative problem solving on people never goes well. And if you aren't in a position of power, in other words, you're, one parent, one teacher who's hoping the administration is going to consider this, it's of course even more important. Oh my gosh, this is a perfect example of life in a school. Tanisha in the chat, fire drill. I'll be right back. So you really want to try to avoid doing plan A. So what does that mean? Well, you don't want to do plan C, which is, all right, this is too much. I'm not sure I can do this. So you want to approach this through plan B. And what that is saying, sounds like I've got my concerns, my reasons I'm interested in collaborative problem solving, my reasons I think it's important to go about this in a different way. What I don't know is the other person's perspective, point of view about where things are at with discipline. And by the way, if you listen to that, you might be surprised that they share a lot of the same ideas, which will open up doors. If they don't, you've still got to sort of confront that reality as well. So I know it sounds like a pat answer, but I would employ the process. I would use collaborative problem solving to try to understand the other folks' perspectives who you're trying to bring collaborative problem solving to, share your concern, and sort of bring them to the table together.
That being said, we have resources that we can share with you that are great introduction. So when you get to the point in the conversation, so as Stuart's saying, you start and you say, hey, I'm curious. I know that there are a lot of schools in the area that are changing their discipline practices post-COVID. I'm wondering what our discipline policy is here at the school and what your thoughts are on that, right? You open it in a very neutral way. You get their concerns and their perspective. That leads to a conversation. Now, let's say you've gotten to the point where they say, oh, there's a whole approach about that. Like, what is this? I've never heard of collaborative problem solving. That's where we can help. And we've got some free resources. Stuart did a TED Talk a number of years ago that is really useful as a short introduction. We have a slightly longer introduction that you can pass on to administrators or to interested teachers to get people on board. Because it would be really hard if we said, and you need to also basically do an intro training on collaborative problem solving for these administrators to get them on board. So that's the part we can help with. We do have some materials to jumpstart the conversation or take them from mildly interested to really understanding the approach and thinking about whether it fits in their setting. And I think what we'll do is we'll send everyone a link to access those materials so that it's very clear where they are. They're available on our website, but we'll send you information about exactly where to go for that information.
Alisha, I just want to respond to a few things that are people mentioned in the chat. And welcome back, Tanisha. We were laughing at life in school. A couple things here. Lisa, you're in the midst of trying to implement and cross a large urban district, so 40 plus schools, which of course is quite a challenge. And fortunately, your school district is partnering with us for deeply to try to implement, because that's a complicated process that really needs to be very thoughtfully rolled out over time. But when I see a comment from Kelly, for instance, with a goal of system-wide implementation a couple years from now, it's great to sort of see that you've got a timeline to work with, because you can again go about this in a very thoughtful way, trying to first get some champions on board to generate some enthusiasm, create some local experts before you start rolling things out more broadly and encounter many of the challenges that we're going to talk about today. And it goes without saying, whenever we have districts that have a time frame to work with and want to prioritize this, we are eager to partner with them to help them guide them through this implementation process. So anyone here who's not in that position, of course, feel free to reach out to us. We welcome that conversation.
Yeah, but it's great to hear that folks that are here understand how big an implementation. This isn't just, so we're sending everyone to tier 1 training, right? That this is a big endeavor. And Tanisha, I'm going to ask you to hold on to that. So Tanisha brings up in the chat a specific barrier, which is that you might have other interventions going on in the school that conflict with CPS, or even if they don't conflict, what do you do when you've got multiple interventions and people don't know when do you how do they interact? When do you use one? When do you use the other? And that is definitely a common challenge, and it's going to come up in my list later on. And so we're going to talk about specific barriers, but you're all thinking about exactly the right things. And as Stuart said, we've seen a lot. We've seen things that work. We've seen things that don't work. We also have the time to put into studying this implementation science, how to take an approach and put it in a place that didn't have that approach before, where schools, you have a lot on your plates. And so if you have the ability to let us take that off your plate and help you and partner with you, we can help guide that implementation. That being said, it's not out of the question to have internal folks leading the implementation process. We have seen that happen as well. I did want to transition. I'm keeping an eye on the time and thinking about our other topics. I want to transition to this other piece that we didn't used to focus as much on in our getting people geared up for implementation. And it has become clearer and clearer and clearer what an important piece of implementation it is to make sure the adults are practicing CPS, understanding it well enough to practice it with each other, almost before, at least concurrently with, beginning to practice CPS with the students in the classroom. And so we want to make sure that we take a little time during this call to introduce this idea and to try to sell you on this concept of using CPS with the adults in your school. Because if you can do that, and if you're doing that well, either prior to or concurrently with starting to do it in the classroom, these barriers that come up that you're all naming, having a 40 schools worth of staff to do it with, figuring out how to stage implementation across time, dealing with questions like how do we integrate this with other interventions, as those barriers arise, you know that you have a healthy process in place to work through those barriers and to overcome those challenges. And that's one of the key parts of having a healthy implementation climate. So we're going to have Stuart just talk a little bit about what that looks like when you're using CPS with other adults. And then we'll again go back to the crowd to hear your experiences where this works and doesn't work as you think about system-wide implementation. Stuart?
And it seemed like from responses to what you were describing, Alisha, that this idea of adults practicing this with one another really resonates with folks. I had an experience recently in this school year where a school approached me saying, we really want to implement collaborative problem solving, but we're feeling like our staff are so stressed and often not giving each other the benefit of the doubt and really not in a good place to collaborate with one another. So asking them to collaborate with the kids seems like a stretch. Would you come and do a little training on collaborative problem solving for us amongst ourselves? And it was really helpful for engaging folks in a way that you can see how it sort of paves the road for later implementation. And of course, one of the big things to keep in mind there is the philosophy, right? This idea of skill, not will, and even more broadly, this idea that we're all doing the best to handle the challenges that are thrown at us with the skills that we are able to bring to bear in the moment. That's an incredibly useful construct and philosophy, mindset to start from when working with one another. And, then as Alisha was alluding to, schools will have all kinds of problems that you're trying to solve that aren't specific to discipline and behavior, that might have to do with grading, that might have to do with the schedule, that might have to do with all kinds of things. How do you solve those problems? Well, you can teach people a process for how to solve that. First of all, there's 3 options for how to handle a problem. And the most important one, you can teach them these ingredients. And in this training I did, I actually solicited from them a couple examples of problems and put them in breakout groups after teaching them what Plan B looks like and said, practice a little Plan B with each other over this problem you're having and see if you can come up with some potential solutions. Now, for leaders in a school building, it is especially important to practice what you preach. because the last thing you want to do is tell people, yeah, you need to go do this collaborative problem solving thing. But if I have a problem with you, I'm going to handle it in a very different way. And, that is one of the biggest predictors of successful implementation is the leaders practicing what they preach. And in my view, that's not just doing Plan B with staff, but again, that's looking through the lens of skill, not will, and also realizing that even things like the assessment that we talked about in our first meeting together, those things are very helpful when looking at ourselves, adults, because everybody on this webinar, everybody in each person's school, we all have our own sets of strengths and weaknesses found across those 5 domains of skill that we focus on in collaborative problem solving. And so, one thing a leader can do is a leader can help identify not only their own strengths and weaknesses, but the strengths and weaknesses of the staff and which skills might be good opportunities to focus on as part of career goals. And so you can look much more broadly through the lens of collaborative problem solving when it comes to leadership, supervision, management within a school as well. Now, Alisha, you had already brought up a sort of, an example of one of the types of questions that we got, and a specific one did have to do with, again, how do I convince, a administrator? In this case, it was not to send a student to an alternative education program. And this is where we would say exactly what we alluded to earlier: good opportunity to practice what we preach, to use Plan B. Okay, you've got a solution in mind. They've got a solution in mind. What you want to be careful of is not to do what I call dueling solutions, which is like alternative ed program. No, bad idea. No alternative ed program. We're going to fight over that. No, let's talk about why you want the alternative ed program. What are your concerns? What's your perspective? And now let me share whatever concerns I have, and let's put it together. And by the way, last thing I'll say about this before I open it up to folks is, if you're trying that with one of your colleagues, an administrator, and they look at you and they say to you, you're trying Plan B on me, aren't you? That's where you need to remind them that you actually can't use Plan B on someone. You can use Plan A on someone. Plan B you have to do with someone. And that's where you say, I'm not using it on you. I am trying to do it with you, but just to be clear, all that means is I'm trying to listen to you and take seriously what you have to say. And then I'm hoping you're going to do the same with me. And then I hope we can put our heads together. This is where transparency about this process is very helpful.
Yeah, that question about the alternative ed program was a particularly poignant one. And I think this comes up a lot in schools because the major concern, I think, a lot of times is safety, right? This child committed in this case, I looked up the particular alternative ed program, and it's in Texas, and it's for kids that have committed a felony or some sort of violent act in school. What's the administrator's concern who thinks that this child should be sent out of district to this alternative program? Probably around safety. We can all get behind that. We all share this concern, right? We all want the kids in the school to be safe. No time more than now is student safety on our minds. But how can we hold that and hold that concern in mind, and also hold the other concerns in mind about what's going to be best for this student, the trauma of being sent out of the district, of going to a placement like that. And is there a way that we can do what's best for this student and ensure everyone's safety? Is there? Let's brainstorm that. Let's at least think through that before we consider these out of school placements. That's the conversation that you want to get to. So I'd love to hear what this brings up for folks that are working in schools, either because you've been trying Plan B and collaborative problem solving with others in your school, or this is making you think of places where you could. Any brave souls?
From where I sit, I think it's got to be something that I think is actually a really good leadership model, because the whole premise that I see behind collaborative problem solving is actually helping the other person upskill. So if your role as a leader, as I see it, is to upskill your team to become future leaders, then that needs to be the model that you adopt as a leadership team. My philosophy of my team has always been, I'm not going to walk in with the right answer, but I want to walk out with the right answer. So I think it's a really good way of building capacity within your leadership team. So it translates to many different settings from where I sit, which is great.
Such a great point, Lucas, about building skill, and especially right now where we have a ton of teachers resigning post-COVID and with safety concerns. We don't want to lose our good teachers. So if we can, instead of saying, oh, this teacher is so rigid and I don't want to work with her, and making her life miserable until she leaves, wouldn't it be better if we could manage the situation in a way to build that flexibility skill, to model that, to build the skill, to get to a place where we're putting both our concerns on the table and coming to solutions that work for everyone, and keeping our skilled teachers, our good teachers, because we're building those other skills that may get in the way, that we think are getting in the way of them doing things the way we want them to do them when we're the administrators. Yeah, beautiful. Stuart, you unmuted. Was there something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I just was, Lucas, you talk about this sort of focus on skills. One of the great ways to help people focus on skills right from the beginning is have everybody, have all the adults in the building complete the thinking skill inventory, or whatever. What do we call it these days, Alisha?
The CPS assessment and planning tool?
No, but not the assessment and planning, but just looking at the skills as a checklist, really, and just saying, hey, if I had to rate myself from high to low on every single one of these 20 odd skills, how would I do it? And by the way, you don't need to share it with your peers, but just look at it. Everybody has the same experience. They all walk away saying, oh, I'm glad I'm good at some things, but I got some stuff to work on. And all of a sudden it starts percolating. I wonder if it's my own inflexibility that causes me to butt heads sometimes with the staff and with my colleagues. But you know what? I bet it's things on their side too. So that can be a very useful way, before you just start sort of using the process to solve problems together.
Hey, Kelly, you put something in the chat about using CPS with residential care and treatment students that come. Are you talking about kids that are coming back to school after being in residential? Can you say a little more?
Yeah, they're actually kids that are placed in a residential care and treatment program, and then their facility isn't big enough to have a school of its own. And our district is small enough that they would need to come to us. So we have a self-contained classroom in our high school, and that's where I primarily work with.
And so right now, you had mentioned that you're trying to get the whole district or the whole school doing CPS. Is this where it's starting? Is CPS growing out of then that classroom and going more to the regular education classrooms, general ed classes?
Yep, that's the intent and the hope. We're doing an all staff training in August with the intro to CPS. So we're moving out.
Excellent, excellent. It's funny, we hear when we implement in schools, sometimes we have folks that tell us that are having trouble getting CPS off the ground, and they say, oh, I can totally see how you use CPS with the toughest kids, like the students that you're talking about, Kelly, but I really don't see how this can be used universally with all students in every classroom. And then we have other folks that say, I can really see how this can be used universally for like the easy kids, but not the kids I have in my classroom, when they're talking about self-contained classrooms like yours. And it's funny. So do you have a take on, are you feeling like, whoo, I'm glad I'm using it with these students and I'm doing well with these students? Do you have an opinion about where CPS works best?
Yeah, so being with my staff for almost 10 years now, I know that they're going to be like, oh, she has the really tough kids where my kids usually end up. And if it's working for her, it must work in general. So that's my opinion on it, because they're always like, what do we do with this kid? I was like, well, this is what I do with my students, and your student is going to probably end up to me someday if we don't help him some way. So.
That's a great point. I hope that that's what they say. If it works for the tough kids, then of course it'll work on the easier kids. Be careful of the flip, which is, oh yeah, but you have more resources in your self-contained classroom. You can pull them aside and have Plan B conversations. I can't do that in my class of 28 students. Sometimes there gets like, you know, we can do this with those kids, but not these kids, or these kids and not those kids. And everyone thinks it's easier with everyone else's kids. And the fact is that we see it work in both. If you're using the tiered behavior approach, tier 1 kids, tier 2 kids, tier 3 kids, it looks different with the different levels of behavior challenges, but it's possible to do across all 3.
Well, and Alisha, being our director of research and evaluation, can speak intimately to the fact that we have a fair amount of data that suggests in clinical settings with some of the most severe kids, it's very effective. So, you know, I always say to people, look, don't tell me it doesn't work for your, you know, 2 hardest kids in your classroom, because those the kids we're working with, they left your classroom 3 years ago and have not even been back in the district, and you're paying $75,000 US, that is Lucas, a year for some residential placement for them. So we have, you know, that's the proof of concept with those kids. And then when people have a hard time sort of understanding, you know, how's it work with the easiest kids in your class? Well, first I always say, first of all, it's a hell of a lot easier because they've got decent skills. But we all agree, especially on the heels of the pandemic, that social emotional skill building is crucial for all students, right? Those so-called, you know, 21st century skills or future ready skills. And, you know, as we talk about in the book, and we've talked about in a previous meeting, you know, collaborative problem solving is aimed at building many of those skills on the list of things that we routinely these days refer to as, you know, SEL oriented skills. So any other thoughts, folks, on this notion of sort of adults using collaborative problem solving in the building with one another, leaders, thoughts, experiences, questions, concerns?
How might Plan C work among adults?
Yeah, well, so it can work in a few different ways, Tanisha. It's a great question. So first of all, you know, as a group, you may decide, hey, we've got, say, like 6 vexing problems in our school right now that we're at odds with one another over. We can't solve them all at once. So for instance, we may decide, you know what, I'm just going to use an example from the school I told you about, that this question about whether grades should be visible to parents on a weekly basis or not is causing so much consternation in our community across home and school that we better figure this one out. And this question of whether kids should be allowed to wear hats or hoods in school that keeps coming up all the time, you know, we've been dealing with that forever. So we do want to get to that. But for now, maybe we're just going to sort of put that aside, and we're not going to deal with that one just yet. So that's sort of a prioritizing that you might do as a community, right? Now, having said that, though, on an individual basis, you may decide that there's a problem you have, perhaps with one of your colleagues, perhaps you're a school leader with somebody you know, who works in your school, and you may decide that once you understand their concern or perspective, that your expectation doesn't need to be met at that point, that you might drop your expectation around that particular problem. And again, just like we teach with kids, for now, it doesn't mean drop forever. You got bigger fish to fry. You got other things you're going to try to prioritize. Does that help, Tanisha? Cool.
I'd like to move us along to the next topic because I have a feeling barriers and challenges to implementations is going to be a hot topic with this crew because we've got some people that are already in the process of implementing. Is that okay, Stuart, if I move us along?
It is. Let me sneak in one final thing, because Tanisha's question is a great one, because it's not all about Plan B. There are 3 plans, and she helped us to remember, don't forget Plan C. I hate to say, be the one to say it, but you know, we also have to be aware that there is Plan A. And there are times where you may, perhaps if you're a leader, et cetera, at a school building, you may decide that you're going to do plan A for now. Using the model, what we want you to say is be aware of what that's going to achieve and what it's not going to achieve, what problems it'll cause, but why you might decide that you're going to do it. And again, if you're going to do it, hopefully you're going to do it for now. But there are 3 plans, and you'll need to employ all 3 at different times, hopefully much more plan B than anything else.
As you say that, Stuart, that makes me think of something that we see sometimes with administrators that we're working with. So district level or school level administrators that want system-wide implementation of CPS in their school. And there are some teachers that are resistant. I think from a CPS perspective, I'm not supposed to use that word, skill, not will. Their flexibility maybe is lagging, and they're not coming along with the rest of the staff as well. And this, by the way, is something that can be totally expected. We know from this implementation science that I told you about that you will have your early adopters, just like, the new iPhone comes out, and there are the people that always run out and get the brand new iPhone. And there are the people that still have their flip phone because they're like, what? It does everything I need. Why do I need the newest iPhone? Right. And the same thing happens when you're implementing a new approach in the school. You have the people that are like, I love that. I want to help lead it. I'm totally in. And then you've got the folks at the end that are going to be the holdouts or the late adopters. So we can totally expect that happens. Now, administrators, when that happens, they've got 3 choices, right? They can, as Stuart said, they can say, hey, you're a teacher in my school. We have expectations at this school. I expect you to meet them. Everyone needs to be having Plan B conversations, filling out your Plan B worksheets, doing all of these things, and I want to see them on my desk by the end of Friday, and try to impose the use of CPS. They can, and they do. Some of them do. Some of them choose to Plan C it, and they say, you know what, we've got 15 or 20% of staff that seem like they're resistant for whatever reasons, or their skills getting in the way. We also have 80 to 85% of staff that are doing pretty well with this. We're going to focus on the 80 to 85% and get them really great, and let the other folks just kind of sit back for a while doing what they feel most comfortable doing. We'll get to them eventually. And then there are some administrators, and this is hard in the middle of implementing, that engage in problem solving with those tougher staff, with those that aren't coming along, and figure out what are the barriers, what are the challenges, what's getting in the way, and how can we give you the support that you need for that. So that's another place where Plan A, Plan B, or Plan C could work for you, depending on a lot of things, including your own style, where you're more comfortable, how much energy you have, how much support you have, what your resources are, et cetera. And as long as you know what could happen, Plan A, what could happen, challenging behavior on the part of the teachers. They could fight back and teach, or they could stop talking to you, or any number of things that teachers might do. What's the risk of Plan C? Well, they're not meeting expectations. You're letting it go. They're not going to come along. Don't expect those Plan B worksheets to be on your desk from them because you're letting it go. Maybe that's fine with you for now. So just know the pros and cons of each of the plans. That's another place that we see it coming up a lot. All right, transitioning to other barriers, and we're going to get back to Tanisha's point earlier, which is one of our most common barriers. So I'm going to name 5 of probably our most common challenges or implementation barriers. And I'm just going to describe them briefly. And then we're going to go where you want to go with them. So I'm trying to spark your thoughts about the barriers that you've either seen or might expect to see in your school. And if you come up with others that are not on this list, we can talk about those as well. But I do want to introduce these as our most common ones. So number 1, staff saying that they don't have time to use Plan B in class. So lack of time to practice the approach and use the approach. That's a very, very common challenge that we hear from teachers. The second one is staff buy-in. And that's, as I mentioned before, you can always expect some staff to not be bought in because they're those late adopters or the holdouts at the end. And then sometimes you go into a school or a district and just kind of as a cohort, that staff is really not on board with the philosophy or with the idea of implementing anything new, because perhaps they feel like what they were doing was working fine for them. The third implementation challenge is what we like to call flavor of the year. And that is really one of two things. Either the administrators or the implementation team isn't giving enough time for the implementation to take hold and for the buy-in to take hold. So for instance, Breckenridge is planning to be implementing by the end of 2024. That's giving some time for the ups and downs of implementation, for it to not work and to address the challenges and to come back and try again. If you say, I want everybody to do CPS by the end of this year, and then when it's not going great, next year, you do some other training, you bring something else in, that's flavor of the year, and that's not going to work. And we see that happening a lot. Flavor of the year also sometimes looks like teachers telling us, this is never going to work because our administrators bring in something new every year. And so I don't even bother paying attention in the trainings anymore because they're so kind of disillusioned with the follow through because the school is in this cycle of flavor of the year. The fourth one is weak leadership support. That also looks a couple different ways. Sometimes the leader likes the idea of CPS and brings us in to train all the staff in CPS, but doesn't necessarily come along to really see what it looks like, what the nitty gritty of the collaborative problem solving approach looks like. And so the support is kind of there, but weak, because when real challenges come up, the administrator doesn't really understand what the teachers are faced with implementing this approach because they really don't know enough. The other way it looks is when we're brought in to train a whole district, because the district level leaders want CPS in the district, but we might have an individual school leader, say a school principal, who's like, yeah, our superintendent's into this, but I don't like this for my school. It doesn't fit with my personal philosophy. And so the whole time we're trying to implement in that school, the leader's kind of not giving us the time and the resources and the support that we need with the staff to do it. And then the fifth one is fit with existing initiatives. And that's the one that Tanisha brought up. Fit with existing initiatives, just like it sounds, maybe there are already behavioral approaches happening, real operant approaches that feel like they're conflicting, or maybe there are just other approaches like Pbis. That's one we hear all the time. Our school is already doing Pbis and now the teachers are confused. How do CPS and Pbis go together? Well, in fact, CPS and Pbis can go really nicely together, but it takes some work and education around that and some thinking and some conversations with the staff so that they understand. But that fit can sometimes cause conflict. So Tanisha, let's start there. Tell us a little more about the conflicting initiatives that you see in your setting, and then we'll talk about through some solutions.
So everything you just said, Pbis, restorative practices, I see this well aligned with Pbis, especially around social skills and skill development. That's the lacking part. And I think I heard Stuart say it a couple of sessions ago and it never went away. And I believe he said it. So if you didn't say it, Stuart, just take the credit. It was reinforcements don't teach the skill. And so that is definitely in my mind. Like, we sometimes think that if the incentive is packaged well enough and the kids are wanting that bad enough, then we're using that to somehow teach the skill, and that doesn't work. So yeah, especially the reinforcement piece that can get in the way. I don't see it as a time piece around impacting time. It's more of a philosophy. This is the way in which we prevent time on the back end by solving a more intense type of situation. So I see how it fits into restorative practices. I see how it fits well with Pbis. But the thing about it that was luring for me was cultural responsiveness, and it has social validity. The student, right, or the person who has the problem or is experiencing the issue is the one that's involved in resolving it. And so that was the lure for me. And I wonder if I sell it that way, how might that be something that is also motivating for the adults that would be implementing?
Absolutely. Stuart, it looks like you want to say something.
Yeah, I think, Tanisha, you're hitting upon something really important, which is, before you end up trying to implement CPS, you're always doing other things, before then. And the school's already got their priorities and initiatives. And obviously, you got to be careful of not overwhelming people with too many things, but it's looking for integration. I mean, first of all, you want to make sure that these initiatives aren't butting heads, as we talked about. But once you see that they can go together, you're looking for how to integrate them so that you can sort of appeal to training that's already been done, to language that is being used, so that it feels familiar to people and doesn't feel like yet another thing to be sort of lumped on top. And you're right that whether it's Pbis or restorative practices, those are sort of easy to think about what integration looks like.
One of the things this reminds me about is the importance of having an implementation team or a committee of people, a group of people that have been CPS trained and that are thinking through these systemic challenges. And this is one of those big systemic challenges. And if you have a team of people, whether it's, formally, we meet every week, we meet every other week together to talk about CPS implementation, which I highly recommend. But even if not, even if you've just got, that there are 4 people in your school that have been tier 1 trained, and at least you're all speaking the same language, it can be really useful to sit down and actually do what we call it a crosswalk. I forget where we got that from. So, but a crosswalk between approaches, because you named a number of different approaches, and including cultural sensitivity and things like that, other things that are really important to your school, and sit down with each one of those separately and take some time to say, okay, what is this approach and what is CPS? What's the philosophy behind it? And what's the philosophy behind CPS? When do we use it? And when do we use CPS? And really kind of look at all of those things and then look at the places that those go together. When can we use both of them? When do we need to use them separately? Do we feel like this approach is for this type of kids only, and this approach is for another type of kids, and why? And then just like everything else and kind of our core message here, listen to the concerns about that. Because there may be other people first in your core team that's working on this. And then when you bring those ideas back out to the greater staff and say, so what do you think about that? What if we were to use restorative practices and have restorative practices be one of the solutions that we can turn to often when we get to the solution generating phase of the Plan B conversation? How does that feel to everybody? What concerns do you have about doing that? Is that enough? Is that for the folks that are really into restorative practices? Does that feel like enough? Does that feel like a solid enough interaction of the two? Because different people will have different ideas about that, but having other people to help you walk through that, so it's not one person trying to figure out how to integrate all 5 of those things that you named, Tanisha, will be really important. And really taking your time and doing them one at a time can also be important. I have a school that I was working with recently. They were really struggling because they have a number of BCBAs on staff that do applied behavior analysis. And they were saying, we're really feeling as we do more CPS coaching, there's a lot of tension with the BCBAs that are in this, and they feel like this is a threat to them, their jobs, right? That can feel very threatening. And we talked together with their implementation team about whether or not those can actually be integrated in the school. And what they came to is they have a few self-contained classrooms with kids that are that have severe intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities, where they're doing ABA to teach expectations, to help kids remember what the expectations are. Like when we walk into the classroom, we sit down first thing in the morning on the square. And if kids really don't know the expectations, aren't remembering the expectations, they haven't become automatic yet, yeah, ABA can be useful for that if you think through what the pros and cons are and what the downsides of it are. Once the kids know the expectations and they're not meeting the expectations, then we have to move to something else. And that's where we can integrate CPS and integrate the two. And the implementation committee went back because they weren't ready. They weren't ready. They didn't want to fire all their BCBAs, at least not yet. They weren't at that point in implementation. And this really worked for them in the first 2 years of implementation. So you can integrate those things, but you really need to take them one at a time and think through the places where they will go together, the places they won't go together, and what to do in the places where they won't go together. So that's just one really specific example. What else on that list of barriers that I mentioned, or your own list of barriers that you've encountered in trying to do this, the challenges to implementing? Do you folks want to talk through and hear some best practices or solutions too?
Glad to hear it, Tanisha. While people are thinking here, and Lucas, thank you for your comment about the evidence section of the book, and the evidence has grown since we published the book as well. So make sure to consult the research page on our website, which will always have latest citations for papers and the like. So other thoughts, folks, about the different barriers, whether that is not having time to use this, buy-in, flavor of the year, leadership support, or anything else that comes to mind that's not on this list that you've experienced to be a significant barrier, or at least anticipate it.
So Tanisha said that time doesn't end up being a huge barrier for them, but are there other folks that feel like time to use CPS, that ends up being a struggle in school? That's usually the biggest challenge for educators in classrooms. I don't have time to have a plan B conversation with a student. Lucas brings up, yeah. So being new is like added on top of that, right? Anytime you bring a new vision or something new, and you say, this isn't what we do here. But when you're new on top of it, you're foreign to them. And they're like, oh, no, we're rejecting your whole idea because you clearly don't understand how we do things here.
Yeah, Lucas, I suggest the response to "you don't know how we do things here" is to say, or "that's not how we do things here," is to say, you're right, that isn't how you do things here. That's why I'm bringing it up.
That's why I got employed to come here. That's right.
So Lucas, if they were to say, that's not how we do things here, how we do things here is, how would they finish that sentence? What do they think they do that's not CPS that's working for them?
Yeah, on what level is it working for them? That's what I query, because the focus, I don't believe, is necessarily on the young people. I think the focus is on what works for them to get from the start of the day to the end of the day. And there's actually no long-term objective or outcome from their work.
So it's a very short-term discipline, whatever we do in response is, it's very like get the kids out so that I can teach the rest of the kids and get to the end of the day.
Well, so my school is the last chance for disengaged youth. So if they fail at my context, there's no other place for them apart from juvenile justice. So yeah, I was blown away by coming into the mentality of students playing up, send them home. Like, whoa, that's not what we do. Yeah. So, but that's what they've been doing for 7 years, kicking them out like a mainstream school. It's like, no, we've got to be better than that, because these kids are in care wards of the state, those sorts of things. No is the answer, unless there's something really drastic going on. So to rewire that process is significant.
Lucas, I think that's a great example of something we were talking about before, which is, I imagine everybody in this book club would agree with your perspective on keep your eye on the long-term outcome, not just getting through the day with as great compliance as you can possibly induce and get home. Everybody would agree. And yet it sounds like the staff are saying partially what's important to us is getting through the day, easily enough and getting on to, dinner with our families. And so doing plan B, you're going to need to hold their perspective, their concerns, or in this case, what I would say their goal in mind while introducing your goal. And what you're going to need to make sure is that, they might be saying their goal should trump yours, and you're saying yours should trump theirs. Plan B is going to be, I wonder if there's a way for us to help manage the day so that things don't get out of control and you guys aren't exhausted and aren't being mistreated and things like that. And we are paying attention to the long-term outcomes for these kids, because I am concerned about that as well.
Mhm.
They're really good staff, really good people who mean well. I just think they've been doing it for a long time, that they can't perceive that there is another way that'll work.
Mhm.
So it's getting the energy back up to try something new.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. And they may feel that by you coming in and talking about another way that's similar to those BCBAs that I mentioned before, that feels threatening, right? What, am I going to lose my job? Is my job going to be harder? You're going to tell me that I don't know anything. And so a lot of reassurance. I'm not telling you any of those things, but if we could find a way that you could stay and get home to your families and and be safe and all those things, if there were a way to do those things and protect the long-term outcomes of these kids, would you hear me out? Would you give me a chance with this? And that may be what, like, okay, so have some faith that I'll hold your concerns up here too, right now, while we try this new thing. I'm keeping an eye on the time. And I mean, we could do this for 2 hours, and it's been such an engaged group and folks that are really doing this work. We really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, it's so nice to have a small group too to talk through these things with. And I encourage people to check out the other points in the chat. Tanisha pointing out the ways in which the traditional ways of going about things are rather labor intensive, even stacked up against a full implementation of CPS. Lisa's last comment, being the only person. It's hard to be a culture carrier if you're the sole person, which is why, when we partner with schools and districts these days, our first goal is how do we create a group of champions? And because it's got to be a group it can't be held by one person. So we are running up against the time here. So I think we better, unfortunately, try to wrap things up a little bit here. I think, one of the themes from today is that systemic implementation takes a village, right? And so you sort of find your allies and build those champions and create that village. But I do want to point out that lots of great movements are originally started by one person. And one person trying to get someone else who might be like-minded on board, and then somebody else, and all of a sudden you're starting to build some momentum. So we do hope that we've given you a number of thoughts along those lines. I forgot to mention early on in our first slides that we hope one of the things you all will do is go run a book club of your own now. And if you go to our website at thinkkids.org and click on the books and resources, you'll find the school discipline fix right there. But right next to the book is a link for you to actually download the discussion guide that can serve as the structure for you to run your own book group. So we really hope you'll do this, and that's a good way to spread the word as well. And I think the last thing I'd like to say before we sign off here is, well, first, Alisha and I'd like to thank you all for joining and for contributing and discussing with us. We hope it's been helpful. And, as you head out and try to do this, there's so many questions about how do you get other people on board and get buy-in and things like that. Perhaps remember the most important thing, which is not only do kids do well if they can, but of course, adults do well if they can. Teachers do well if they can. Paraprofessionals do well if they can. Principals, vice principals, deans do well if they can, okay? And when you approach each other from that perspective, you're much more likely to stay regulated and to have a productive conversation with one another. So thanks for spreading the word about this work. Thanks for joining us. And we'll look forward to our collaborations with many of you all in the future. Thanks so much, everybody.
So great to see everyone. Take care.